Hello guys. I got cut off in my last video for part 1 of Colonial life, but basically that's all you needed to know from that little segment was the triangular trade, right? Africa to America brought slaves, and this was really the origin story behind slavery in North America. Today we are going to look at diversity, really dig deep on diversity as and you can look it up on your phone. I have it up on my phone. Go to our Google Classroom to find a link to the video. Diversity. As the colonies along the Atlantic coast took shape in the mid-18th century, they become grouped by region: New England, Middle, Chesapeake, and Southern colonies. Among these regions, there were some general similarities, including temperate climates and more than adequate average rainfall, which are critical factors for maximizing agricultural production. Surplus crops provided the most important exports in all the regions except in New England. Although what colonists grew depended on a variety of factors such as climate, topography, and soil types. All of these regions depended heavily on Britain for manufactured goods. Most colonies enjoyed easy access to the Atlantic Ocean, both along their coast and via river systems navigable for miles inland. However, provinces like North Carolina, whose outer banks blocked the passage of larger ocean-going vessels, and New Jersey, which had no major river system, became dependent on their neighbors for transporting their products. Despite these similarities, the colonies displayed regional differences. So, they all can be compared to each other in terms of temperature and topography and weather patterns. But each separate colonial region, Middle, New England, or South, has its differences, has very big differences. The area known as New England was comprised of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. This region was highly English with scatterings of Scotch-Irish population. With its proximity to the ocean, this area's major commodity was fish. Other major exports included whale products and timber. Major imports included sugar from the West Indies, wheat from the Chesapeake region, and manufactured items from Britain. The Middle or Mid-Atlantic colonies included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. This region was known for being the most ethnically diverse during the colonial period. Large concentration of Dutch, Scots, and Scotch-Irish settled in New York, along with some Germans and a few Huguenots, or French Protestants. New York also had the largest concentration of Africans in the Middle colonies. New Jersey had a similar ethnic makeup with a handful of Swedes in the Delaware River Valley. Delaware was heavily English, while Pennsylvania was predominantly German and Scotch-Irish. The middle colonies had a greater population of slaves than New England. These slaves were necessary for the wheat harvest of New York. As a result of their bountiful harvest, New York's major export were wheat and wheat products. Like New England, the middle region relied upon Britain for manufactured goods and upon the West Indies for sugar imports. The Chesapeake region of Maryland and Virginia, also known as the Upper South. So some APUSH textbooks would say there's 4 regions: the New England colonies, the middle colonies, the Chesapeake colonies, and the southern colonies. This is what this topic outline suggests. But there are a few textbooks that only points to the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. So the Chesapeake region was the top of the southern colonies. So it was the wealthiest of the eastern regions. A heavily English region, this area was also populous with Germans and Scotch-Irish. The Chesapeake also had a great deal of racial diversity, with a population of 60% white, 40% black. Not surprisingly then, slaves were common on both large and small farms. Tobacco served as the major crop of this region, although wheat also became a popular crop. The Chesapeake exported both tobacco and wheat, along with some food, to the West Indies, and imported manufactured goods from British and slaves from the West Indies and Africa. The final region along the eastern coast was the southern colonies, or Lower South, which included North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. This region was the most racially diverse, with South Carolina being the only colony with a black majority. That's important. South Carolina, black majority. In addition to the multitude of Africans, this region was populated mainly by the English, with Scots, Scotch-Irish, German, and Huguenots figuring into the mix. Like the Chesapeake, the Africans were necessary in the Lower South as a labor source for the plantations, and were commonly seen on smaller family farms as well. In addition to tobacco, major exports included rice and indigo. Cultivation practices for rice and indigo were extremely brutal and labor intensive, and many slaves died from the brutal conditions. As a result, slaves from the West Indies and Africa were a major import to the area to replenish the supply and sustain productivity. Other major imports included manufactured goods from Britain and sugar and rum from the West Indies. So, we see slaves as a dominating tool to get the agricultural economy jump-started in the Chesapeake and southern regions of the colonies. And that would serve as as we see slavery throughout the history of the United States to the Civil War. Slavery is predominant in the South because of the agricultural needs and the agricultural economy of the South. So let's take a peek at family and social. Okay, family and social life for all Anglo-American colonists was colored by certain common conditions. A pre-industrial economy that put a premium on owning land, primitive knowledge of medicine by modern standards, and a social hierarchy shaped by the notion that God had obtained some to be rich and others poor. While these characteristics shaped life throughout the colony, there were regional differences, especially between the two most ethnically English regions, the Chesapeake and New England. So we see a big difference between the Chesapeake colonies and the New England colonies. The Chesapeake colonies were typically considered to have a more challenging environment, both physically and emotionally. Mortality rates in the Chesapeake were high, and most children had lost one or both parents before adolescence. In the Chesapeake region, all white men and women were expected to marry. Women were expected to give birth, rear children, and manage the household. Respectively, it was the husband's responsibility to participate in public life, including taking leadership roles in the church and government. Many 17th century men in the Chesapeake region found the expectation to marriage and family difficult to meet. Males outnumbered females, although this ratio became more balanced by the 18th century. Those who did marry entered into a permanent union. Divorce was unimaginable, and separations were rare. Chesapeake's gentry or upper-class men married at an average age of 27, women at 22. Parents chose their children's spouses, usually putting an emphasis on power and property. This emphasis eased somewhat during the later part of the 18th century, and marriage for love became more common, particularly among the non-elite. Throughout the colonies, wives suffered a civil death, the extinguishing of their property rights in marriage. Virtually alone among the 18th century colonies, Virginia and Maryland continued the practice of granting women whose husband died without a will 1/3 of his personal property and life interest in 1/3 of his estate, but many husbands actually willed their wives far less. So wives did not get much of the husband's property or money in the early days. It's weird to say that now and to understand that in today's world, because the wife usually gets everything these days. Unless you're not married or your wife died before you, then it usually goes to your children. Necessity and availability of materials dictated housing in the Chesapeake region. Homes in this area were generally built by wood. A typical 18th century Chesapeake house was 16 by 20 inches, 1 or 1.5 stories high, and with a steeply pitched roof. Homes on elite southern plantations were larger, usually 2 stories and made from brick. Although servants on small family farms would sleep in lofts under the homeowner's roof, plantation slaves shared small wooden huts segregated from the planter's home. In the South, food was considered a pleasure rather than just a means for subsistence. Herbs and spices were used liberally, particularly among the elite. Fowl, meat, and game were standard, with the gentry occasionally enjoyed shellfish as well. The southern climate was conducive to a variety of vegetables, and the residents of the Chesapeake region made these vegetables a staple of their diet. Slaves sustained on a diet made primarily of corn, often served as a thick gruel. So, let's talk about education. Education was emphasized by the Chesapeake's gentry. They were to a great extent self-educated, studying classical literature, history, philosophy, and philosophy, and science. They hired tutors for their children and sent their sons to England to learn dancing and other arts of gentility. For the rest of the Chesapeake populations, schools were few and far between. Some planters hired a schoolmaster to teach in the field, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts built charity schools. William and Mary, the only institution of higher learning in the colonial South, was chartered as a grammar school in 1693 and did not function fully as a college until the 1720s. It was designed primarily to develop ministers, but did offer non-theological subjects too. Religious instruction was limited for younger students, with children learning primary from catechism. So education, as you can see, was not usually high on their priority list, do you think? No. Chesapeake families tended to live on isolated farmlands or plantations, so the church was the primary outlet for socialization. Recreational activities, including dancing, card games, and gambling, took place in people's homes. Feasting was important both as part of the church calendar and as purely social affair, but the premier event was the horse race, which everyone could view, but on which only the gentry might bet. Another major form of diversion for the Chesapeake settlers involved the pursuit capture, and slaughter of wild animals. The gentry hunted deer and, less desirably, foxes. The middle-class southern course, which is the act of hunting small game such as rabbits on foot. Farmers and laborers, the low end of the social ladder, engaged in pulling off the neck of a goose hung from a tree while riding by it. They participated in lots of weird activities to for entertainment. Alrighty. Life for New Englanders bore more differences than similarities to life in the Chesapeake region. The basic family structure was the same. Adult men and women were expected to marry and reproduce. However, 17th century New England offered a much lower mortality rate, with estimated lifespans of nearly 70 for men and over 60 for women, with death in childbirth accounting for the gender difference. The average number of births in a family was 8, with 6 children surviving to adulthood. Although the expectation of marriage existed in both the Chesapeake and New England, the reasons for marriage and the methods for attaining it were very different. New England's Puritans considered marriage to be a civil covenant rather than a religious sacrament, and that love should occur prior to marriage, so arranged marriages were highly uncommon. Elite families in New England did still try to arrange marriage based on the financial and political considerations, but most marriages required the consent of both parents as well as the children. Unlike the Chesapeake, where divorce was unheard of, New England allowed divorces for such things as adultery, excessive cruelty, or desertion. Believing that a compassionate marriage was a woman's best security, New Englanders frowned on trust and other devices meant to secure a woman's property in marriage. However, they did allow a jointure or marriage settlement in which the bride's family contributed money or property to a dowry, and the groom's family set aside an equivalent amount in real estate in the bride's name. Family connections were equally important among African slaves in New England, with slave owners living in closer proximity to one another than in the South. Slaves could better maintain family and friendship bonds. The slave population in this area began to sustain itself at a higher number of female slaves resulted in a higher slave birth rate. This made America one of the few slave societies in history to grow by natural reproduction. So this was an experiment. New Englanders typically made their houses of hardwoods, switching to softwoods in the 18th century as deforestation claimed oak and cedars. Even the upper classes relied primarily on wood. basing their houses with brick only late in the 18th century. Two common designs for a middle-class family were the salt box, 2 stories in front, 1 in back, with 2 large chambers on the first floor and smaller rooms on the second, and the Cape Cod, 1 1/2 stories with bedding areas above the first floor. Common New England houses were built to accommodate large nuclear families without servants. They often contained a hall with the great fireplace, a parlor where husband, wife, and perhaps the new baby slept, and a full kitchen placed in the rear under the slanted roof. New Englanders also had underground cellars for storage, salting, and dairying. Like people in the Chesapeake, 18th century New Englanders could increasingly purchase utensils, furniture, and other such items from Britain. So when we talk about house structure, right, normally this is still going on today. You can look at old houses in both the South and the North and still see some of these characteristics that this outline is sharing with us to today. You can even look at some plantations in the South. Not that far from New Orleans. So that's a wrap for Colonial Life. I hope to see you guys in the next video. What's the next outline? Next, we are going to talk about scientific and religious transformations, such as the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. So stay tuned for that.